Hello there. Wanting to expand a little bit on one of my previous videos on the Damnonii. If you've not seen it, go back and watch that because this video is kind of relevant to that one. I'm going to focus on a few of the settlements and hit a few of the key points about them in the local area. The reason I want to do this is because the Damnonii were a big tribe that existed for a very long time and were one of the key founding nations of modern Scotland. They existed in one form or another, potentially, depending on how you define existed, up until like the 13th century. They were a very old culture that was very widely connected. Now, I'm not going to get too into that because, as I said, I've done a video on the Damnonii, and the whole point of this series is mostly to focus on pre-Roman and historic sort of Celtic culture. But as Scotland is a little different to England and Wales in that, again, those borders are modern borders created by the Romans. So one of the reasons I focus on this is my personal area of interest is prehistory. And when the Romans came, Britain was dragged kicking and screaming into recorded history. And that's what England and Wales have. And going forward from the Roman invasion, particularly England, but also Wales, they're not recognizably the people they were before the Romans. Of course, there's elements within both cultures, particularly within Welsh, but there are also strong influences from other multicultural societies that the Roman Empire brought and in the periods afterwards. But Scotland, as it was never fully conquered and was never permanently conquered even when it was invaded by the Romans, has held on to that culture for a lot longer, meaning the Damnonii as a tribe continue to exist long into and then after the Roman period. So I'm going to explore that a little bit, but not in the same extent, because again, that's kind of outside the scope of the series. I'm going to focus on a few areas. One of them, one that I kind of like and find interesting as a hill fort, is DunDonald Hillfort. So a bit of an overview. DunDonald Hillfort. There's evidence of metalworking there, meaning it was well connected, very industrialized little place to be. It's fairly close to the coast, and there's evidence of pottery there that comes from all across Britain as well as Europe. The modern fort, if you can call it that, because it's got a castle on it now, but the sort of first incarnation of it we know about would have had earthen banks and timber structures on the sides. It was later reinforced and sort of partially rebuilt with dry stone walling and cladding on the sort of ramparts. It had roundhouses in it and was a pretty standard hill fort from that point of view. It was about 60 feet above sea level, giving it a commanding view of the area. The name DunDonald, Dun specifically, in, again, covering the fact that I'm not a linguist, translates as fort. And Donald is most likely from the Proto-Celtic languages that existed in that area, Brythonic, Old Welsh, and potentially even Cumbric. And it's just, I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce some of the possibilities that it came from because I can't, but it translates from those older words into Donald, which is anglicized version of those older languages, and that's where we get the name DunDonald. That seems to have happened in perhaps 500 AD. That's when the fort seems to really come into existence. However, with its position, pottery finds, other things, from what my research has told me, it may, and I'm saying may, date back to as early as 500 BC. But that doesn't mean there was continuous occupation. It may have been occupied and then reoccupied, which was a fairly common thing that did happen with some hill forts. This one seems to have been a bit more of a sort of royal palace in a sense. Donald, the man, although there's no records of him directly, if he was a member of the Cumbric royal family, which there's not really any records of, he would have likely been a chieftain of the local area. He would have either been the sort of commanding chieftain of that area, or he would have been a sub-king, a sort of feudal lord, for lack of a better term, and that would have been his castle. Again, to put it in a sort of slightly more modern lens to where it's easier to sort of understand what he would have been doing. He would have had men at arms, being Celts, maybe even women at arms, to reinforce law and security and order, whatever form that took in that area. The fort itself, again, I quite like. It's why I decided to start with it, but it was part of a network of forts that were utilised by the Celts in the area during the early Roman invasions around that time. One of the more famous Celtic war leaders against the Romans, Calgacus, who was supposedly a descendant of Caradog, who was the famous Caraticus, which would be the Latinized version of his name, who was the sort of famous rebel rouser against the Romans down in England. He fled north but was eventually captured by the Romans. His descendant, Calgacus, also led the rebellion in Scotland 100 years, well, not 100 years later, a few decades later. Now, he eventually became the chieftain of the Caledoni tribe, a tribe that you should recognise the name of, as the old name for Scotland was Caledonia. It actually derives its name from the Caledonian, of course, which was actually a catch-all term again, because those damn Romans used to refer to the whole of that part of Britain as, because they never bothered to always recognise a singular people. They just kind of went, that's the people we know, that's who they all are, even though there were subtleties beyond that. Just to cover a couple of others that were from the area, to give you a sense of scale and just the diversity of the fortifications that were in this area when the Romans turned up, and in the years after as well, when the Romans were present, obviously at Hadrian's Wall, looking north at the savage painted barbarians. Ridiculous, by the way, again I'm going to say it, ridiculous that anyone in Britain or anywhere in the world charges into battle when armour is available, naked, with nothing protecting you but paint. That's stupid. I firmly believe that they did paint themselves. I just do not believe that they were all stupid enough en masse to do that, to charge into battle naked. Drugs or not, I just don't buy it. And we know that in the sort of AD period they were wearing chainmail and helmets. Those are facts, and the Romans, as I've said before, are not always the most reliable sources of information, and there's just no way. Come on, there's just no way. It's stupid. It's slander. It's liable. Hell, it's Roman slander of an ancient people that they saw as savage and barbaric. That's pretty much it. Do I believe they all had armor, all had helmets? No. Probably the wealthy, probably the warrior elite, the sort of chosen amongst them. They had it. But not everyone. The fact that it existed, the fact that chainmail in and of itself is a Celtic invention, should tell you that it was not unavailable and they didn't not use it. Anyway, getting a little off points. The level of fortifications in the area. We'll go with Kemplor Dun. Kemplor Dun, again, is a dun, so it is a fort, but unlike the bigger one, this is not a big residence. Kemplor Dun perhaps had two walls, one of which was 14 foot thick, potentially. It's a little overgrown, a bit of a mess now, obviously, because it's very, very old. These tend to date back into the prehistoric periods. Some of them are obviously built later. Similar to Brocks. Brocks are quite famous up there. Duns were stone built, similar to Brocks, but they were not residential. They were more of a pure fortification. They were typically round, although I do believe, although I'd have to look this up and check in some of my books, I do believe some of them may have been square or rectangular, but I'm not 100% on that. It's just something that's bobbing around in my head right at this moment, and I'm just saying it because it is bobbing around in my head. But that's another video when I've actually refreshed my memory on that particular subject. Kemplor Dun, as I said, little fort, but an actual fortification. And then there is a larger one, Harper Crossed Hillfort. This was much larger, 300 feet in diameter. It had several foot thick stone walls running right the way around it, as well as, of course, earthen embankments. This was probably built around maybe 150 BC, maybe, from some of the research I've been able to find. This was unlike the other two. This was the other end of the spectrum. Yes, it was fortified, yes, it was defended, but this falls more into the more traditional type of hill fort, in that it was a residential area, not a military camp, not a base for a chieftain as a sort of like his castle on the hill. This was more of a place where people lived. It was an oppidum. It was a large settlement, a civitas, a capital of sorts, an actual. They always say that the Celts didn't have cities, and I always think that depends on how you define a city. I don't think this was a city. I'm just going off on a tangent on that. I don't always buy, considering they'll call something a city that existed in the middle Mediterranean at the time with a population of say 2,000 people, and you come here and there are actual settlements all across Britain, some of which are populations reaching 5 or even 10,000 people, but we don't call them cities. I don't know. So that's just another quirk. Sometimes I think the Victorians have a lot to blame for this. So the Roman propaganda and Victorian propaganda, it's very hard to sometimes find a nice middle ground. But these represented, across the Damnoni's territory, evidence of a well-fortified and organised society that resisted the Romans. Yes, they were, for a brief period, conquered by the Romans. I mean, the Romans were the superpower of the day. No one was truly defeating them. The real thing that defeated them in the northern parts of Scotland was pretty much the weather and the terrain. Although they were very successful, the Romans, at actually beating the local tribes in pitched battles, just like they were all across the rest of Britain. In some cases, Tacitus claims that like 20,000 Britons were killed in a single battle, with although many thousands survived, but only a few hundred Romans were killed, and they all melted back into the forests, and a war of attrition started. The Romans couldn't win that because they weren't geared for that kind of war, and they just retreat back to Hadrian's Wall, which is what we see. But these fortifications, as I said, were some of many, and there were many across that area, because it needed to be secured, probably not just for intertribal warfare, but by this point fighting against the Romans. But these fortifications have their roots much further back in history, indicating a general climate of hostility in the area. That is my personal observation and interpretation of the evidence. If you're building fortifications, you're fortifying yourself against someone. Someone's threatening you, so you're defending yourself. To me, that's just intuitive logic. But I may be wrong, there may be evidence to the contrary, but it seems logical. You don't build walls unless you're trying to keep something out, and if the Romans aren't there yet, it's your neighbour, the Votadini, or the Caledoni, or somebody else, or the Epidae. You're trying to keep them out. So they were building these forts all over the area. There are several large, like the major settlement, and then there are smaller ones, like the Duns, which are scattered us all across the landscape in commanding locations and within range of one another, importantly, so that you can gallop a fast horse between the two, probably, and support one another, as you see with chains of fortifications in the modern era. You build them within range of one another, and you have a network of different types of them. Some of them major settlements to protect the people, others more, for lack of a better term, a more strictly military presence on the landscape. I don't think calling anything in the Celtic world a strictly military thing would ever be truly wholly accurate, but again, through the modern lens, we can go with that to make it easier to comprehend. And those are some of the things I just wanted to touch on. There are, as I said, many, many more. And I've only broadly brushstroked the history of these things. DunDonald, for example, is probably the most modern of the three that I've mentioned. The others date back into prehistory, and although DunDonald may date back into prehistory, the real evidence for it, particularly named DunDonald, is a modern one dating from around 500 AD-ish, when the man probably lived. What the fort was called before that, it may have been called DunDonald, but it probably wasn't. What it was called, or even if it was as we see it, or as it's reconstructed to have looked, who knows yet? We'll see as the future unfolds and more evidence comes to light. But my guess would be, and this is a guess, it's a hypothesis based on the research I've been doing, and by the way, I'm going to link in the description the official website for the sort of the DunDonald tourist site, which has a lot of this information on it. I had a good read of it just to sort of make a few quick notes as well. As again, as I say in my last video, my specific knowledge of the tribes in this area is a little less than in the south, purely because the Romans documented things down there, whereas up here they didn't to the same degree. I do have a few references from, as I say, Tacitus and others, but generally it's not as well documented. and you're going into the AD period, which is what I generally try to avoid, but I'm only doing it now because I kind of like this fort, because I like that it was stone built, and I like that it was so well obviously defended and like nicely put together, and part of a string network of fortifications that did date back into prehistory. It's the sort of melting pot of history that appeals to my sense of interest, and hopefully yours too. I am, as I said, giving these the absolute broad strokes, so I'll link in the description the link to the tourist site, just because again it has a nice bit of information about DunDonald Castle, as it is now called. But with that said, I'm at the end of this video. I've rambled on for long enough. Like, share, subscribe, hit the bell notification icon if you like this video and you want to see the others. Also, just going to say, I hit 1,000 subscribers on this channel a few days ago as of the making of, or me filming this video. I've not had a chance to put a post out to say yay. So I'm saying it in this video. Yay, I'm not going to keep saying that. I'm really not. But thank you to everyone that has subscribed. And also check out my other channels that are linked in the description below. If you like this one, maybe you'll like those too. With that said, we're at the end of this video, and thank you for watching. Bye bye. I'd just like to say a thank you to everyone for watching that video. I hope you enjoyed it. I really enjoy making these. If you did enjoy it, please consider giving a like, share and a subscribe, and maybe checking out the other videos on the screen right now, and in the description box below there are links to my other social media accounts.